If you'd been born 40,000 years ago, you would have spent almost your entire infancy being held. Not occasionally, not when you cried, constantly by someone, almost every hour you were awake. That's not a guess. It's one of the most consistent patterns researchers have found studying how hunter-gatherer societies actually raise children, and it's wildly different from how most of us picture ancient parenting. Step back into a hunter-gatherer band, tens of thousands of years ago. A small camp, 20 or 30 people, no separate nursery, no playpen, no crib in another room. A baby in this setting wasn't handed off to be looked after alone in a quiet space. A baby was carried, almost everywhere, against someone's body, in nearly constant physical contact with another human being. Researchers who study modern hunter-gatherer societies, the closest living comparison we have to this ancient way of life, describe astonishingly high levels of physical contact between infants and caregivers. We're talking about Barbies who are picked up, held, and carried for the vast majority of their waking hours, far beyond what's typical in most industrialized societies today. And here's the detail that surprises people most: that caregiver wasn't always the mother. This is where the real story gets interesting. Anthropologists use a specific term for this, allomothering. It refers to childcare provided by someone other than the biological mother, and in hunter-gatherer societies, it wasn't an occasional favor. Research on groups like the Hadza of Tanzania has found that allomothers, the aunts, older siblings, cousins, and unrelated camp members, account for a massive share of total childcare, sometimes estimated at around 40 to 50% of the time a child spends being cared for. Think about that ratio for a second. Nearly half of a child's care in some of these studied groups came from someone who wasn't their mother. Compare that to a lot of modern parenting setups, where one or two adults often try to handle the entire load almost completely alone, exhausted without much backup. Ancient childhood, by comparison, looks less like a two-person job and more like a constantly rotating team effort. Who exactly stepped into these roles? It varied quite a bit depending on the specific group and circumstances, and researchers are upfront that this isn't one single fixed pattern across every hunter-gatherer society on Earth. In some groups, older siblings turned out to be a major source of hands-on care, sometimes even more involved day-to-day than adult relatives. In others, grandmothers played an outsized role. Some researchers have proposed what's known as the grandmother hypothesis, the idea that human females evolved to live long past their own reproductive years, specifically because grandmothers who helped raise grandchildren improved those children's chances of survival. It's a genuinely debated idea among researchers, but the supporting evidence is intriguing. Among the Hadza, for example, grandmothers who spend more time foraging for food have been linked to better health outcomes in their grandchildren. That said, having a grandmother around wasn't guaranteed. Researchers studying these family structures have pointed out that plenty of children didn't have consistent access to a grandmother's care at all, sometimes because she had passed away, sometimes because she lived elsewhere, sometimes because she was busy raising younger children of her own. Ancient childcare wasn't a perfectly designed system with guaranteed backup. It was a patchwork, built from whoever happened to be available, willing, and nearby. Fathers are where things get more complicated, and more interesting than the old stereotypes suggest. For a long time, the dominant image of ancient family life was simple. Father hunts, mother gathers and cares for children, end of story. Real research complicates that picture quite a bit. In some hunter-gatherer societies, paternal involvement in direct childcare is remarkably high. Among the Aka people of Central Africa, researchers have recorded what's described as the highest level of direct paternal care ever documented in any human society studied. Aka fathers have been observed holding their infants for substantial portions of the day, a level of hands-on involvement that would surprise a lot of people who assume ancient fathers were almost entirely absent from hands-on caregiving. At the same time, researchers point out that even in these high-involvement groups, fathers still generally held infants less than mothers did across most measured ages, and the degree of paternal involvement varied enormously from one society to the next. There's also a real debate among researchers about why men hunted at all. The traditional explanation assumed hunting was primarily about provisioning children with calories. But some researchers have argued that hunting, particularly hunting large or risky animals, may have functioned partly as a costly signal of skill and fitness, a way of showing off rather than a direct form of parental investment. This remains a genuinely contested question in the field, not a settled fact, and different hunter-gatherer societies likely organized father involvement in noticeably different ways. What's striking, pulling all of this together, is just how distributed the actual labor of raising a child seems to have been. Not one mother working in isolation, not a single dominant caregiver shouldering it all day after day. A shifting, somewhat improvised network of relatives, and even unrelated camp members, each contributing pieces of attention, protection, and physical contact, stitched together into something that functioned well enough to raise children successfully across an enormous stretch of human history. So if childcare was this distributed, constantly shifting team effort, what did the actual day-to-day experience of being a child look like? And how long did all this intensive care actually last? The answer to that second question is longer than you'd probably guess, and it's tied to something genuinely unusual about our species. Start with breastfeeding. Researchers who have studied weaning ages across dozens of traditional societies, comparing hunter-gatherer groups with small-scale farming communities around the world, have found an average weaning age of around 30 months, roughly 2.5 years old. That's not a strict universal rule. Different groups show real variation. Among the Hadza, weaning has been recorded at around 30 months. Among the Aka, closer to 42 months. Among other groups studied, anywhere from 2 to 4 years. But across the board, extended breastfeeding, well beyond a baby's first birthday, shows up again and again as the norm rather than the exception. Compare that to modern expectations in a lot of industrialized countries, where weaning by 1 year old, sometimes earlier, is treated as fairly standard. Looking at the wider span of traditional human societies, that early timeline is actually the unusual outlier, not the default setting for our species. Here's where it gets genuinely fascinating from an evolutionary angle. Humans wean noticeably earlier than our closest great ape relatives. Chimpanzees, for comparison, often nurse for around 4 years or more. So in one sense, human Barbies are weaned relatively early compared to other apes. But here's the twist that makes ancient parenting so demanding. Even after weaning ends, human children remain nutritionally dependent on adults for years afterward, in a way that's actually unusual among primates. Researchers describe a distinct stage that follows weaning, sometimes called early childhood, roughly spanning ages 2 through 6, where kids are no longer nursing but still can't reliably feed themselves. They can't yet forage effectively on their own, can't process certain foods without help, and still rely heavily on mothers and other group members to provide and prepare food for them. So while weaning might happen earlier than it does for chimpanzees, the overall stretch of nutritional dependence in humans runs remarkably long when you add it all together, stretching the total period during which a child needs serious adult support well past what nursing alone would suggest. Why would evolution favor such a long, resource-intensive stretch of childhood dependency? One major theory researchers point to involves brain development. Human brains take an extraordinarily long time to fully mature compared to other primates, and that slow developmental timeline likely demanded an equally long period of protection, feeding, and social learning to match it. Building a brain capable of complex tool use, intricate social relationships, and flexible problem-solving seems to have required buying extra years of safety and support to get that brain safely to adulthood. This is also where the distributed caregiving model becomes less of a curiosity and more of a necessity. A years-long stretch of total dependency is an enormous burden for 1 or 2 adults to handle completely alone, especially in an environment where food had to be hunted or gathered fresh, often daily, with no refrigerator, no store, and no guaranteed surplus sitting in reserve. Spreading that load across grandmothers, older siblings, aunts, cousins, and even unrelated camp members wasn't simply a nice cultural quirk. It was very plausibly what made raising children with such enormous nutritional and developmental needs sustainable at all, generation after generation. It's also worth noting what daily life looked like for the children themselves once they were weaned and a bit older. Researchers studying multiple foraging societies describe weaned toddlers, roughly 2 to 4 years old, often joining mixed-age groups of other children, roaming around camp together, only returning to a mother or another adult when they got hungry or tired. That's a strikingly different model from a lot of modern parenting, where 1 or 2 adults frequently supervise a child's activities closely and continuously throughout the day. In these ancient and traditional settings, once a child reached a certain age, much of their socializing, and even a good portion of their early education in practical skills, came directly from other children, not constant one-on-one adult supervision. Step back and look at the whole picture together. Ancient childhood wasn't shaped by one rigid set of rules followed identically everywhere. It varied by region, by group, by circumstance, and researchers are careful not to flatten that real diversity into one tidy universal story. But certain patterns do show up again and again across very different societies and continents. Extended physical contact in infancy. Breastfeeding stretched well past a single year. A long runway of continued nutritional dependence even after nursing ends. And running underneath nearly all of it, a genuinely communal approach to care, where raising a child to adulthood was treated as a shared responsibility, distributed across an entire network of people, not a task quietly handled behind one closed door. So the next time someone says it takes a village to raise a child, there's a strange kind of accuracy hiding inside that old saying. For most of human history, that wasn't a metaphor. It